Hello and welcome back. During this final lecture, we will be briefly looking over some of our assigned readings for this week. In addition to the two primary source readings from Dante's Inferno and the Malleus Maleficarum, you had three secondary source chapters to work through: a reading about the Dante's Inferno video game, a chapter on medieval Total War's portrayal of warfare, and a chapter on the representation of the Aztec Empire. We will look at each of these in turn. As always, you should have already read these before watching this lecture. First, we will look at the chapter by Angela J. Weissel and Kevin J. Stevens, entitled The Middle Ages in the Depths of Hell: Pedagogical Possibility and the Past in Dante's Inferno. Weissel and Stevens, WNS from this point forward, explain that by claiming a connection to the past, in this case the famous book The Divine Comedy by Dante, video games set up certain expectations of authenticity and responsibility to the past moments they claim as their origin. And while Dante's Inferno itself was not set in 14th century Italy, the work speaks volumes about this time period and the concerns for Dante, Italy, and the European West. Yet with the game based on Dante's Inferno, there are striking differences from the book. Rather than Dante the anxious pilgrim and poet, we have Dante the warrior, fighting his way through hell rather than being carefully guided and protected by Virgil. And Beatrice becomes the damsel in distress who is captive to the power of hell rather than above it. While this new counterfactual take on Dante's journey through hell might grab the interest of players who would otherwise know little about the historical Dante, such an approach is dangerous as well, telling players more about the present than about the past. Before looking at Dante in more detail, WNS explained the new trend in scholarship to view video games as a valuable pedagogical tool. While pulling from scholars that we have engaged with in our other readings, such as James Paul Gee, WNS point to the fact that while these scholars have shown the utility of video games teaching concepts like complex systems, most have not connected video games with history directly. Ultimately, WNS argue that these games always follow the rules of play rather than the rules of the material they're based on. Thus, players are unlikely to learn specifically about Dante, history, or the Middle Ages, but rather they will come to understand what modern idealization and present perception of the Middle Ages entails. WNS next go on to explain how the presentation of Dante and his journey through hell in the video game is quite different than in the Divine Comedy. Thus, rather than forced to journey through hell due to his own weakness and out of a need for self-understanding, this Dante is a crusader knight who is killed and goes to hell. Likewise, rather than understanding the penitential aspect of God's perfect plan of justice and mercy, this Dante experiences hell as a challenge of a different source, killing his way through the infernal regions. And in fact, he eagerly enters into hell in order to save Beatrice. In hell, Dante loosely matches his literary counterpart in descending one level at a time. One of the strengths of the game, WNS maintain, is how well the gameplay frames Dante's journey as also the player's journey. Those who play the game become Dante, and are themselves journeying deeper and deeper into hell. Dante's Inferno likewise embodies the notion of the hero on the quest, utilizing RPG leveling elements in order to satisfy players. Similarly, in some places the game actually does a good job in accurately recreating Dante's hell, from the creatures that guard the various levels to the geography of the four rivers that flow through hell. And yet, the central pillar of the game remains the very fictitious story of the Crusader Dante. Thus, players unfamiliar with the real story will have an incorrect and even tarnished understanding of Dante. And while the game at times remains true to the text, its decision to seems arbitrary. In many ways, then, the core elements of Dante's Inferno have been severely undermined, as Dante can now save those in hell, taking away the notion of divine justice and mercy, and as it is ultimately Dante who saves Beatrice and lets her get into heaven, when the opposite is what occurs in the Divine Comedy. WNS conclude by suggesting that this game offers players very little sense of the historical Middle Ages, instead telling us much more about our own contemporary concerns and our longing for a return to moral simplicity. They ultimately suggest that given the ludic nature of all video games, any game set in the past is necessarily a recreation and a retelling of the past, never the thing itself. Yet because of this, players are able to have transformative experiences with these games, not unlike Dante's own transformative journey. Thus, in the end, by using the Middle Ages to wrestle with contemporary concerns and desires, the game is quite like the original Dante's Inferno, where Dante likewise brings in the mythical and historic past to wrestle with his own contemporary concerns. A few questions on the reading. First, WNS suggests that video games are ultimately unable to offer players any genuine simulation or presentation of the historical past, only shedding light onto contemporary concerns and understandings. Do you agree with them? If you disagree, how might video games get around the problems that they pose? Question number 2. WNS argue that any historically based video game is ultimately a remaking and a reinvention of history. Are they right? How different is this from even academic scholarship on the historical past? And third, do game designers care about properly presenting the historical past, or are they only interested in the marketability of certain time periods or individuals? Next, we will look at the chapter, The Portrayal of Medieval Warfare in Medieval Total War and Medieval II Total War, by Gregory Fedorenko. In looking at Medieval Total War and Medieval II, Fedorenko argues that on the whole, both games do a good job accurately portraying medieval battlefield warfare, despite a few slips. Rather than looking at the simple accuracy of these games, however, Fedorenko instead explores the discrepancy between our modern notion of total warfare and the medieval understanding of total war. In tracing these comparisons, Fedorenko analyzes battles, ravaging, warfare in the state, and nationalism. In looking at battles, Fedorenko notes how these games privilege land battles over static engagements such as sieges and devastation of the surrounding environment. Thus, players typically fight many more pitched battles than sieges. This, it seems, was a purposeful decision by Creative Assembly to increase the game's playability, mirroring a Hollywood feel rather than the historic medieval era. Such pitched battles, in fact, did not occur as frequently during the medieval period as we might expect, as such battles always carried the risk of destroying the kingdom if the king was captured or killed, as frequently was the case when these battles did take place. Likewise, on the battlefield, armies would not have been as well drilled, organized, or able to be commanded as these games suggest. Rather than fight on the battlefield, total warfare more often involved the ravaging of the enemy's territory. This crippled the enemy by destroying his economic base as well as by breaking the will of his subordinates as it was their land being destroyed. Such ravaging was often enacted according to a predefined plan and with specific strategic objectives in mind. Ravaging could be used to draw enemies out into battle, as well as to indirectly assault enemy strongholds. And when this strategy failed to force an enemy to capitulate, the most frequent next step was a protracted siege, which could take over a year to conduct. Fortifications could likewise be used to offensively control areas. And in fact, many of the wars in Western medieval Europe were defined by a large number of castles and fortified positions across the country rather than exclusively concentrated engagements. Most wars, then, were fought from siege to siege rather than from battle to battle. Fedorenko next turns to the European state. Rather than the ever-shifting web of feudal alliances that define medieval Europe, the total war games instead present a small number of participants more closely resembling the modern-day nation-state. These sweeping distinctions are likewise reflected in the static borders on the campaign map. These recreations, as well as the frequent set-piece battles that players fight, ultimately reflect 19th century Europe more than the 15th century. Finally, in terms of nationalism and national pride, the Total War games do accurately touch on some of the nationalism that occupied the actions taken during medieval wars. Yet again, taking this too far and viewing these polities as proto-nation states is a concept of the 19th century. Ultimately, like some of the other aspects of medieval Total War 1 and 2, these games embody a sense of total warfare that is more akin to 19th century Europe than to the medieval era. A few questions based on Fedorenko's interesting chapter. First, given the shifting development to states, ideologies, and technologies throughout history, how might video games handle these changes and avoid simplification? And question 2, Is it possible for games to maintain a strict historical accuracy and still keep the games marketable? How might a Medieval 3 Total War game attempt to meet this level of historical accuracy? The final reading we will look at is Dominance and the Aztec Empire, Representations in Age of Empires 2 and Medieval 2 Total War, by Joshua Holdenreid. Holdenreid argues that video games offer players and students some unique advantages to looking at history. While the linear narratives of other media suggest predetermined outcomes, video games can convey uncertainty and contingency by creating an interactive environment where the player can play and replay through countless variations on a given scenario. This ultimately offers players an experience of history much closer than that which historians' academic articles and monographs ever could. Holdenreid likewise admits certain limitations to video games, such as their oversimplification of historiography. Likewise, the necessary focus by developers on gameplay and the market need for games to be fun can force designers to overlook or contradict certain facets of the historical past. To demonstrate the effectiveness of video games in representing history, Holdenreid turns to the Aztec Empire and its simulation in the video games Age of Empires 2 and Medieval 2 Total War. These games, he argues, successfully reflect and integrate notions of dominance that defined both the rise of the Aztec Empire as well as its eventual fall with the arrival of the Spanish. Holdenreid traces these notions of dominance throughout Aztec history. Initially establishing their capital of Tenochtitlan, present-day Mexico City, around 1325, by the 1450s, the Aztecs dominated the region. Notions of dominance were central to both their understanding as well as their maintenance of their empire. The Aztec origin myth saw their ancestors as the ones dominated, yet promised that one day it would be the Aztecs who were the ones dominating. With the expansion of the Aztec military, this did in fact occur. Through their military dominance and the establishment of the Triple Alliance with neighboring tribes, the Aztecs soon dominated the region politically and economically as well. Ultimately, the Aztec culture placed heavy emphasis on warfare and sacrifice, ensuring continued Aztec dominance, a control that was likewise reinforced through sacrifice and ritual such as the Flowery Wars. Given the dominance of the Aztecs, how then did Spanish commander Hernan Cortés defeat the Aztecs and the 200,000 people that occupied Tenochtitlan with a force of less than 1,000 soldiers? The answer once more turns towards notions of Aztec dominance. While they had managed to build a massive empire upon this sophisticated system of dominance, in doing so their neighbors grew to resent them. The Aztecs likewise saw war as a sacred contest between equal opponents. Thus the Spanish were able to take advantage of these pillars of Aztec dominance, as well as the Aztec technological inferiority, to peel off their allies and subjects, demoralize the Aztec army, and ultimately force its collapse. One of the reasons why such themes of dominance cater so well to representation by video games, Holdenreid maintains, is due to the fact that success in a majority of video games is measured by how strongly or swiftly players can dominate their opponents in one capacity or another. First looking at the 6-part Aztec campaign in Age of Empires 2, Holdenreid looks at these various scenarios and assesses how well the game developers represent notions of Aztec dominance and tensions within the Triple Alliance. Yet as the counterfactual campaign ultimately sees the Aztecs winning out against the Spanish, Holdenreid questions how well Age of Empires addresses and accounts for the two primary reasons behind the Aztecs' defeat. While the game does little to address the Aztec and Spanish differences in cultural perceptions of warfare, it does tackle the Aztecs' technological inferiority. Thus in the campaign, the Aztecs are able to acquire, study, and reproduce horses and gunpowder, thereby eventually neutralizing the Spanish's technological advantage. Turning then to Medieval 2 Total War, Holdenreid explains some of the key differences between the two games, including the unstructured narrative of Medieval 2 compared to the linear storyline in Age of Empires. Despite this lack of structure, though, Holdenreid points to various ways in which Medieval 2 accurately and authentically represents the dominance and defeat of the Aztecs, especially in its effective representation of the unequal technological strength between the Spanish and the Aztecs, for example at the Battle of Atumba, which players can fight. The game even integrates the contrasting cultural attitudes towards war by pointing out the Aztec chiefs as good targets on the battlefield. Ultimately, Holdenreich concludes, both of these games, despite weaknesses in the representation that necessarily accompany any medium, are successful in helping players to understand some of the key issues behind the Aztecs' fragile system of domination. A few questions then for this last reading. First, do you think that there are limitations to how authentically video game developers can portray minority cultures and states, given that these games are made in the West and with Western values and frameworks in mind? And question 2, Holdenreich suggests that one of the main reasons why video games tend to oversimplify complex historiographical issues is due to limitations in technology. Do you agree? Do you think that video games will ever, or even want, to simulate these complexities? That's all for this week. I hope that you enjoyed this set of readings. In our lectures and readings next week, we'll be moving into the modern era. See you then.